one of the things is I think people have this assumption that airlines run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and there's a midnight flight that goes from Cleveland, Ohio to White Plains, New York, direct, and it takes off at 12 and lands at 3, and that's just simply not the case. So realistically, what we kind of lead with, and that's here at Airfreight Express Global as well, is kind of transparency and level setting that expectation and explaining why, like, hey, look, your deadline is either unrealistic or there might be like an even higher service level that we can provide in the air freight space, whether that's hand carry, or whether that is a charter flight or something along those lines. I have moved charter flights both internationally and domestically. Those are always the quickest, right? We've also done them for like outside of the AOG space. We've done them for heart transplants because, hearts and lungs, they only last so long outside the body. I think it's,
right.
Don't quote me on this, but I think it's like 10 hours, whereas like a kidney or a liver, like those last for 18 to 24. So, you have to move like the surgical staff as well as the actual organ.
Before we jump into today's episode, a quick word from our sponsors. Looking for a freight-specific CRM? Sales-CRM is built exclusively for freight brokers and freight agents. Manage shipper sales prospecting, track your carriers, and monitor the lanes they run, all in one powerful platform, and all for one extremely affordable price. Try Sales-free for 14 days with no credit card required. Visit sales-crm.com today. Operations teams, streamline your driver communications with vendor flow. Their platform organizes all of your driver communications in one place, boosting satisfaction with faster response times, and no more juggling between multiple apps. Get a free consultation today to see if vendor flow is right for you. Freight World, meet Purple Squirrel, the connector that links you with the top talent and winning opportunities. From inland transport to maritime freight forwarding, they deliver competitive commission splits and genuine support because they give a shit. Ready to earn more? Explore your options with Purple Squirrel. Now, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the Think Freight podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm your host, Thomas Werdine. It's my pleasure to have my friend, Zachary Meese. He's the business development manager at Airfreight Global Express. Welcome to the podcast, man.
Hey, man, appreciate you reaching out to me, and glad we have this opportunity here to kind of sit. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So, I'm excited to kind of talk shop and see how we can, help get our name out there and help you out as well, man.
Hell yeah, dude. So I want to dive in, kind of right from the beginning. So you're in logistics. You're obviously working at Airfreight, but you're a digital nomad. You're living in Latin America. We're going to dive into that as well. But first, why don't you tell the audience kind of what that first kind of introduction kind of into logistics was? And did you always see yourself working in this industry, or was that kind of something that just kind of happened and you just kind of fell in love with it?
So absolutely not. This was not at all part of the plan. I went to a little small university out after high school called Muskingum University. Go Muskies. About an hour east of Columbus, Ohio, where there is actually a population in rural Ohio. But, I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do. So I went and I actually secured like a pretty broad degree, right? I was a sociology major. I just like people, different cultures, studying that. And it seemed to be like broad enough that I could kind of get into something. And a former fraternity brother of mine actually got me into my start at logistics. At first, I was working in a parts warehouse for a regional airline. And then that eventually transitioned me to working as their AOG coordinator. So what that was doing was sourcing and buying a lot of aircraft maintenance materials for C-checks when they tear down the plane and put it back together, make sure it's all working.
Yeah.
And then organizing the logistics behind it when we didn't have things in stock. So a lot of it was warehouse transfers, and then, of course, some purchase ordering. And I did that for about 9-10 months, and then unfortunately was laid off. And then kind of got started over at NetJets, which is based in Columbus, Ohio, doing their AOG. And they do everything on demand, right? So if we need it, we're shipping it same day, doing air freight logistics, organizing that with our carriers and our partners and our forwarders, and also organizing out of the Columbus hangar as well. And then later that just kind of kept growing and growing across a couple different air freight providers. And that's how I got into it. And turns out
Yeah.
I tried a lot of different verticals there, including healthcare as well. But really, my specialty has always been like international air freight logistics, mostly time sensitive things, but a couple things like general goods, e-commerce, things like that.
No, that's pretty cool. So when you were with NetJet, it sounds like all of that freight was all like what my listeners mostly would know as like spot freight, right? Is it's kind of what it sounds like?
Yeah. So essentially, if you have aircraft maintenance materials, it counts as a liquidable taxable asset.
Mm.
Now that depends. I think that's from the federal side. I wasn't a part of those conversations. It might be the state. But so essentially, in order to avoid that, what NetJets would do is they would buy everything that they needed, maintenance material wise, a la carte. So maybe you need like an avionics unit, and then they would organize the shipping to get to the plane as fast as possible wherever it was broken. And then conversely, there might be larger things such as winglets or radomes, which are the front of the plane that protects the radar in the front, that gives it that round shape up front. So those are like
Yeah.
larger shipments and heavier shipments. And so, yeah, it's all spot quoted based on an as need basis, point A to point B, no consolidation.
No, that's pretty interesting. So like most of the stuff I'm assuming is very time sensitive. So like when you have something, like you said, some of that bigger stuff, what is kind of the timeline on say you say, hey, we need to order this today. We have a like a wing or something that needs to be replaced. What is kind of like those timelines to have something like those bigger parts ordered and stuff like that?
So it depends on the supplier when you can pick up. Usually, the suppliers were pretty hip to, what we needed, our requirements in order to pick up. So usually you get it probably a couple hours after you submit the purchase order. But realistically, I don't think people understand this. Like, it costs money to keep your plane like either in a hangar or on a ramp
Right.
somewhere, and those fees can rack up and they're charged per hour. So realistically, domestically, we were shooting for anywhere between 6 to 18 hours trying to get it, depending on where it was, right? This
Yeah.
could be something that we're sourcing in California, needs to get to New York, or, anywhere really. Wichita, Kansas is a big hub for that, actually, in the private jet space. The joke is they build all the planes there and then they fly away and they never come back. But yeah, so I mean, realistically, like it's very time sensitive, and with that, of course, comes like a little bit of price increase, but it's still much cheaper than keeping your downed aircraft overall.
No, that makes a lot of sense. What are some of the most crazy um I guess deadlines or like maybe the most costly like layover that you guys have ever encountered maybe for a customer?
Uh, I'm going to answer your question with a question because I want to make sure I'm picking the
Yeah,
absolute craziest story.
for sure.
So essentially, like what you're trying to get at here is what was like the craziest deadline that a customer maybe had for us,
Yeah,
or like something that we like in transit did.
maybe both.
So, you know, it, there's so many shipments that have moved in the AOG space specifically that it's
Yeah.
kind of hard to pick that up. One of the things is I think people have this assumption that airlines run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and there's a midnight flight that goes from Cleveland, Ohio to White Plains, New York, direct, and it takes off at 12 and lands at 3, and that's just simply not the case. So realistically, what we kind of lead with, and that's here at Airfreight Express Global as well, is kind of transparency and level setting that expectation and explaining why, like, hey, look, your deadline is either unrealistic or there might be like an even higher service level that we can
Yeah.
provide in the air freight space, whether that's hand carry, or whether that is a charter flight or something along those lines. I have moved charter flights both internationally and domestically. Those are always the quickest, right? We've also done them for like outside of the AOG space. We've done them for heart transplants because, hearts and lungs, they only last so long outside the body. I think it's,
Right.
don't quote me on this, but I think it's like 10 hours, whereas like a kidney or a liver, like those last for 18 to 24. So, you have to move like the surgical staff as well as the actual organ that's doing the transport or
Yeah. Transplant.
transplant. That's the word I'm
Yeah.
looking for. Thanks, Tom. So yeah, there's that's probably the craziest space is in the medical space because like, I mean, you're
Yeah.
literally handling somebody's life in your hands, like, cause that cannot expire. and you're doing these charter flights and you're trying to get it there within 5 hours, like anywhere in the United States, and sourcing the correct kind of aircraft and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that sounds like a space I would never want to like ever dip my toes into. Is like as much as I love adrenaline and like crazy and fast pace, that just seems a little too like you like you said, you have too many factors. You have lives on the line in that way. I prefer moving produce where I don't have anyone's lives on the line. You know what I mean?
Well, there is and it isn't. So the way I kind of
True.
look at it is, I think a lot of people in general, and we'll probably kind of touch on this, have like this fear of air freight, right? There's a ton of
Oh, absolutely.
regulation. Yeah, there's a ton of regulation that goes into it. And you have to make sure that you're compliant with the TSA or IATA and other countries, and kind of like moving this forward in a way that is accomplishing your customers' needs, but also moving like very sensitive material, whether that's
Yeah.
pharmaceuticals, temperature controlled shipments, or in my case, like those transplants. But realistically, there's an infrastructure for it and it's pretty turnkey now. So if you have the right airline partners, we don't team with like, I mean, we do occasionally, but those integrator services like those FedExes and those UPSs, what we do is we work with like the Deltas, the Uniteds, the Americans, the Southwests of the world, Lufthansa in the international space, and other airlines too, right? We could list them all off. And then we kind of figure out who's got the best performance and then make sure that we're tailoring that. And the airlines have service levels that are included with this. So like in the example I gave, right? For transplants, especially like in the kidney space, like American has medevac and Delta has dash critical. And those come with personalized dedicated resources at the airport to make sure this gets loaded onto the plane and transported to where it needs to go. And there's, of course, also other kinds of solutions such as GPS requirements that, we can kind of provide and other providers can provide as well, and really give you that real-time visibility. So let's say, everybody's flown an airline and they've lost their bag at one point, right? So we don't want that to happen with a kidney or a blood shipment or whatever it is that we're moving, right? That's time critical. So, the airlines, if you have that GPS, you can say, hey, look, I'm seeing it's right here within an accuracy of about 5 meters, right? And it's sitting outside like gate D4 in your terminal at Columbus Airport. And, send a guy there. It's in that area. Please help find it. And like, there's all kinds of solutions that can kind of make that less stressful for you and relying on your tools that you have.
No, that makes a ton of sense, and the kind of way you break it down makes it kind of sound like just kind of like the more normal shipment, right? Like if I'm moving, Zach, my space is previously just like the broker space, so I was moving domestic full truckload, mostly produce. So like I would have GPS trackers on them, we'd have temp tallies, we'd have all these different tracking tools so that the customer had full visibility when it was in transit. And it kind of sounds like that's exactly the same case with air freight, or at least certain air freight, especially these more critical loads, like like in the medical space. So I guess kind of like what to your point, it wouldn't be as scary or like as insane to like move those kind of shipments, but it also I feel like in your own mind you would feel like, damn, this could be, if I screw this up, this could be really bad.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, there's always that risk, right? Like no one likes to call their customer and say, hey, well, like we're missing your load. And I think, you kind of, the nice thing about this is, we have a dedicated operations team behind us at Airfreight Express Global, as well as other people that I've worked for in the past. And, we're not consolidating with other people's shipments. So I think like people think of air freight like FedEx, right? You give it to
Right.
them, they pack it in with a bunch of other stuff going to certain hubs and however they move it through their ecosystem, but you don't have the visibility. But we do. And that's with the airlines. And that's, of course, within our own tracking systems and all those things. So we try to make it as painless as possible, but always, 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 and I stress this, and I'm sure you stress it in the brokerage side of things too, communication proactively and just brutal honesty, really, without sugarcoating, like, hey, this is the issue we're trying to address. This is what we've encountered with your customer, I think is absolutely key. And that's something that like I've been blessed with every company I've worked for, that this is something that they've done and believed in as well.
There's a lot of modes of transportation, right? I mean, whether you're domestic or international, what are some of like the biggest advantages to air freight as opposed to some of those other modes, if it's maybe not as time sensitive?
So actually, that brings up a really interesting thing that I do want to touch on.
Yeah.
And I actually put a LinkedIn post. I think you liked it, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. But I think there's this idea that air freight has to be cost prohibitive and
Yes.
expensive. And sure, there's all kinds of different service tiers, right? So I'll give you an example. I have a guy that we just brought on I'm not going to divulge his company information, but we brought on a guy and he basically has this medical device spray that identifies bacteria in hospitals, right? But all of his bottles and spray bottles and all those different things come from China. And so he was looking, he said, Zach, I'm kind of new to this. We're just getting up and running. Like, should we air freight this whole thing? I said, well, realistically, like we can absolutely do that for you, right? It was 350 boxes. But I think realistically, like what's your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And he said, well, I just don't want to run out and I can't wait 2.5 months for sea freight. And I said, well, let's, portion this out a little bit. Take what you absolutely need to have this month arriving, and then we'll move that via air freight. And in order to save you money, we'll book it as general cargo. And so, some people think it's like, oh, it's probably going to be like $15 a kilo, $10 a kilo. But based on general cargo, which has longer layovers in those places, like this went from Xiamen, China to Hong Kong, and it stayed in Hong Kong for 5 days, and it just got to the US this morning. But realistically, like we had that down to almost $3 a kilo for him. And that's including what we had, like what we were making off of it. And so, I don't think it's that cost prohibitive. And I think like it can be a valuable part of like your continued international shipping. And so, when people say, well, it's got to be way more expensive than this, sure, it's probably more expensive than sea freight. But
Right.
at the same time, like we can move it on a slower pace, save you money, and still accomplish your goals and kind of balance out like your timetable versus what you need on the other side.
It kind of sounds like there's a lot of flexibility in air freight that like maybe a lot of people just don't understand. It kind of sounds like you can almost treat it like, LTL, but like in the air freight space. Um, that's fascinating because, all the times that I've dealt with air freight or a customer saying, hey, this is, I personally had a customer who used to do air freight, but it was, I didn't touch any of it. It was mostly, they had a couple other customers that I handled their full truckload and their partial and a couple other things. But he was specifically like, he handled all the air freight. He loved doing this kind of stuff. And he would dive into like little pieces of it with me. And I was always just so fascinated, but he mostly did all like you said, the time critical and things that really needed to be super quickly delivered to their customers. So like I never really heard about like kind of the other ways that air freight can move. Didn't really know that like in terms of like the logistics side or like moving cargo that it could be like a longer like maybe 5 or 7, 10-day transit where it's maybe hitting a couple other destinations first and then coming stateside.
Yeah, I mean it sounds bad, but you can spend as much or as little as you want, right? So like I said, in that example, we were down underneath $3 per kilo for his shipment, right?
Yeah.
Now I don't know what ocean freight rates are. Somebody that's been on this podcast can probably speak to that better than I can, but I know that that's at least competitive and compelling for what he was trying to move. Now, on the flip side of that, if he's like, Zach, I need this here as soon as humanly possible, we could have done express shipments. I don't know what that would have been. It would have depended on the airline. The airlines set their own pricing, right? And then again, if he's like, well, I can't risk an offload and I can't risk like this package specifically not making it to me in this time. One of the other things we can do is we can actually do hand carries. And Airfreight Express Global doesn't do a lot of them, but it is a service that we offer. And this is where you pay somebody like yourself. Where are you located, Tom?
I'm in Houston.
So I say, hey, Tom, United's got a direct flight from Houston to Medellin. This has to come in today. They actually do. You should take it and come visit. But that being said, we would pay that person like an hourly rate from the time the wheels are up to the time the wheels come back in a hotel if needed. And then, of course, the ticket last minute. And then that person actually sits physically with the package on the plane as their carry-on or their personal item, depending on the size, or they check it as well, which is also an option. And then when they arrive into customs, rather than waiting for customs cargo to process all that, they physically show up at customs in the red channel or another, whatever the dedicated port is at the airport, customs and migration, and they meet a broker. It's brokered immediately, and then they walk it, hand it off to a driver, and that person goes. And then that person gets to spend the night in Medellin, which I can tell you is pretty great. So, and then again, there's charter flights, and that's the absolute most critical. It's also the most expensive if we're being transparent. And again, it just depends on what kind. We've had people move very large freight with us, and my previous providers for like 1.3 million because it absolutely had to be there, and it would cost more money if it were to be delayed.
Now, when you mentioned hand carry, how does that, like, I guess, work? How does that person get the cargo, and how do they essentially get it through? Is it just essentially they're basically using it as their, like you said, their personal item or their carry-on item, and there's like really no, like, it's just kind of a box, or it's not going to be like hazardous or anything like that. What kind of cargo can you generally do with that? Do that with?
So you're actually open up to a lot more. DG is a whole other bag of worms that we can get into if you'd like, or can of worms, I guess I should say. But realistically, historically, that's more for like smaller packages, right? We're talking something that's as big as a carry-on or maybe a little bit less. Now, you do have the option to check it, which means the airport's going to work with you if there is an issue and it doesn't load. And there is an added layer of security there as opposed to just straight cargo. And it also, it's already at the airport. It's being screened. It's going with all the passenger bags and being loaded in the plane. But realistically, like, that person's bringing it on to the plane with them. And that's actually a really good solution for places that have really long cargo processing times. Think in Mexico right now. Mexico's usually pretty bad about their processing times. It takes longer. Whereas in the United States, internationally, at least, once the flight lands, it takes about 4 hours if you already have your pre-clearance done. And then you can get the package and take it to the final destination. So there's a lot of different things here. And the way I always approach it when I'm talking to a new client is, look, what's your goal? What are you trying to accomplish here? And like, for once, I had a OBC to Nigeria, and I had to find a guy who had a yellow fever vaccine. And that was like a whole ordeal. But we got it, and it worked. At least I think it did, if I remember correctly. And so, we were moving through there, and we got it all done. So on the hand carry side, there's a lot of companies that do that. We partner with a bunch of local providers as well, in different countries. And then, of course, again, we primarily focus on the just general air freight.
No, that's pretty interesting. Now, I know we have talked about this a little bit, but what, like, industries have you seen over the last, I know you've been in nearshoring and things like that, but like, what industries have you kind of shift their demand more towards air freight over the last couple of years? And I'll give you an example of a couple of things I've heard, and you tell me if this is kind of correct. Is kind of these like Sheins, and Temus and companies like that who are utilizing a lot of these, but is that with a lot of the bigger providers, or is that kind of across the board that a lot of e-commerce shipments are coming across the board more air freighted?
So e-commerce is definitely one of those things, and they're doing that general cargo that I kind of walked through earlier because it keeps costs low, right? So like your Temus, your Wishes, or the knockoff stores that you buy the knockoff NFL jerseys from, like they're using that. They're also using a lot of integrators. And what I mean by that, of course, again, is like your DHLs, your UPSs, your FedExes, because they're consolidating with other people, can give you a better, or more competitive rate. Now, that being said, the other part of that is, where I really see like a strong demand is still in healthcare, whether that's pharmaceuticals, clinical trials, blood shipments, transplants, like we were talking about. Then I also see in the automotive space, there's a lot of that too, because a lot of this stuff's manufactured from outside of the United States, whether that be Mexico, whether that be Germany, whether that be, pick a country, right?
Right.
And they need to bring this stuff in to be assembled within the United States and put into these cars and actually sold off to the general populace. And if they have a delay on those shipments, it could throw off production. And so where they, in the automotive space, they're absolutely looking for like those more expedited solutions. The other side, of course, is AOG. So that was always my specialty. AOG is never going to go away from that because, again, of those charges that you rack up for a downed aircraft in another place, wherever that might be. But realistically, I'm also seeing a ton of this in the semiconductor space. Now, that's been pretty new fairly recently. I'd say probably over the last 5-10 years, like, it's really been taking off and growing. We're not making them here in the United States. Let's just call a spade a spade. They're coming from other countries. And so, whether that be Taiwan, China, wherever, we're moving those shipments at an increased rate. And so they require those solutions because now they're needing that kind of thing. I think in the future, we're going to see a lot more raw minerals like cobalt, lithium, other things from hard to reach places that maybe don't have that infrastructure to get from one point to the other. I always talk about the Congo, like most of your lithium in your iPhone battery or in a Tesla battery or whatever battery comes from that area, right? But to transport that to a seaport is very difficult because they don't have the infrastructure. And that's really where I think air freight's going to see a big expansion, both in Latin America and, of course, in Africa as well, where a lot of those raw materials come from.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Honestly, I hadn't thought about kind of the raw mineral aspect of it for some of the cobalt and things like that. That's fascinating. Because that makes sense that some of these areas just don't, like you said, they don't have the infrastructure built out yet, and to kind of get those to a seaport. Yeah, I can't imagine what the cost would be. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense where you could air freight it, whether that be all the way to its final destination or even into a seaport to make it a little bit easier.
Yeah, and I think that's something really that a lot of those countries, I'm talking specifically about two continents here, though. Southeast Asia is a little hit and miss. Like, there is definitely a gap there and a need for air freight. So I'll talk about something that I know, like, absolutely, right? I'll talk
Yeah.
about Colombia. If you want to send something, Colombia, really, you can do like a full truckload, or you can do an LTL with some other stuff that you're shipping. But they don't really have highways within Colombia because the mountains just make that impossible. You'd be drilling a tunnel every 10 miles and trying to get underneath that. And like the infrastructure really doesn't allow for it. So for instance, driving from Medellin to Barranquilla, which is the seaport, right? Um, Realistically, if you're driving that direct, and that's not LTL, that's direct, you're looking at 18 hours transit time for something that would probably be about 8-ish hours, maybe 9-ish hours in the United States. But realistically, with air freight, you can move that in 6 hours door to door, depending on the flight from Medellin to Barranquilla, because everything takes 45 minutes. Colombia is a lot smaller, of course, in the United States, but you've now cut your time by 66% and can move it. And so, like, this is that there is some prohibitiveness in that space. But realistically, and like one of the things I'm trying to do, because we've brought on Colombian clients that are trying to either import or export, and we're at Airfreight Express Global, we're trying to figure out ways that we can make that cost competitive so that if it's something that's absolutely needed, we can move it. And conversely, this is Colombia again, but I'm sure it's true in other emerging economies. There's parts of the country that aren't connected by road because there's the rainforest that's there. It's like swamp marsh out on the Pacific coast. And you can't build bridges over that. Like, it would just take too much infrastructure. If you can fly there, or you can boat it, however you want to do that. So if we can fly it like that and make it so it's cost competitive locally within the market, just something I think we do really well, right? We have a Brazil office right now, and we're hoping to expand even further in the coming years. I think there's like a large gap there and a lot of really interesting opportunities within like those emerging economies for air freight. So I'm actually really bullish on the future of it.
No, that's really interesting. We've talked a lot about you've talked a lot about kind of Medellin and Colombia. I want to dive into nearshoring just a little bit, and then more about kind of being a digital nomad in logistics. 'Cause I think those are fascinating. Have you, like, especially coming from that industry for a little while, are you seeing like an increased demand for nearshoring in the air freight sector? Like, is that something that's kind of hit that market yet, or is that still mostly been like, the 3PLs in the US and things like that?
So with TSA requirements, it gets a little fishy about whether or not you can use,
Right.
foreign source labor on the other side, because they have to have what's called a security threat assessment. You have to be TSA certified, right?
Yep.
Now, if you're a broker where you're working with a bunch of different partners, you could absolutely enter that space, or have people to do your tracking and tracing, which I think realistically, and this is a general statement here, but a lot of air freight providers they kind of look at it as a call center mentality, and they blend so many responsibilities into one person, where realistically, if you wanted to break out and say, okay, look, I need a full on track and trace department. Their whole job is to track, trace, update customers, answer emails, or a order entry slot. I think nearshoring or offshoring is a good fit for you. That being said, if there's anything that you need to like, as far as airline bookings, breaking this out, DG bookings, all those different things, that becomes a lot more complicated, at least in the United States, based on the security threat assessment. I will say, and you've probably seen this too, Tom, like the brokerage side's absolutely reaping the benefits of foreign sourced labor. I know that's
Oh
not a
yeah.
popular thing to be talking about, like after a recent election. I'm not getting into politics or anything, but there are some advantages to that, and it actually helps optimize your team on the backside, allowing your people that you've contracted within the United States to focus on your actual revenue making tasks
Yeah.
rather than perhaps focusing on a little bit of everything and getting pulled in too many directions. Example I used to always give when I worked at Airfreight, I came from operations, right? And I still
Right.
very much am involved in operations, process building, as well as some sales now. Um, but that being said, everything was great until one or two drivers called me and said, "Hey, this airline didn't load this," or "Hey, I'm over here at Philly airport. Sorry, Philly, but you're going to a Super Bowl. It's fine. But we don't have it. We don't know where it is. They're not accepting it, whatever." And then, but you're still getting pulled in all these different directions and you're missing the chance to be proactive. So I think depending on how you set it up, and as long as it's compliant with TSA and your IAC regulations, absolutely makes sense to explore this going into the future.
No, that makes a ton of sense. And something that has kind of been a major focus, at least in the U.S., has been Mexico for nearshoring. But but when we talk about, when I say we, you and I, what are some other like Latin American countries that you see as a global like player or global emerging key players for global like nearshoring? Yeah, obviously Colombia being one of them, but there's a lot of other Latin American countries that we're seeing a big push to find global talent in. And I do want to touch on something else that you mentioned after this as well.
Yeah. Let's start with the one thing, and then hopefully we remember the second. I call that the Zach Meese hope, because basically I'll forget too. But realistically, yeah, like Colombia is really growing, especially in Medellin. Like if we're being very honest, there's a lot of foreign investment there. A lot of colleges and universities are teaching English because it's the international business language. There's a lot of bilingual folks. And when I was in the nearshoring side of things, like I didn't speak Spanish in the office. I spoke English all the time and everybody understood me and I understood them and we were all good. That being said, you also see Argentina, you see Chile, I think the Dominican Republic too, but these all have like very specialized sectors. So like,
Yeah.
Mexico's definitely one, especially if you're doing cross-border shipments. I do encourage people to look into that because they're going to have people that know the customs regulations, which I think in the next 4 years are going to be changing very drastically across the board. And then of course, in tech, there's Colombia, Argentina, things like that, Brazil even. And then it really just depends. Now, there's a couple that are kind of falling behind and maybe are not implementing or don't have the infrastructure to teach that English that you need to interact with American businesses. And there's a lot of intermediaries, rather not, if you want to go through an intermediary rather than doing independent contract in another country, some people find that beneficial, other people don't. There's a ton of different things in that space that we could kind of get into.
Now, I actually remembered my second part. So something I think is interesting. So like I come from like obviously the broker space. I was dealing with, a cradle to grave broker. So I would talk to drivers, I'd be talking with shippers, I'd be talking with everyone, dock people, trying to figure out what's going on with our shipment, why they're not loading, an extra 2 pallets of blueberries when we're supposed to get 6. They're only, they gave us 8, or they gave us 6 instead of 8, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? So something I think is interesting. I don't speak Spanish either. So when I had a Spanish speaking driver or a Spanish speaking dispatcher, and that's all they spoke, I was kind of SOL. And something I think that's interesting when you're showing is, if you have people in other countries who do speak Spanish and they can kind of build that culture and they can build those relationships with your drivers, with your carriers, and with some of those customers who maybe have those dock workers, those employees who you kind of do deal with on a time to time basis. I think that can also be kind of a driving force in kind of operations and making money and kind of a reason to kind of nearshore because there isn't as much local talent, U.S. talent that kind of can be bilingual or does speak, multiple languages.
Yeah, I think there's definitely part of that. I remember one time even a personal injury law firm was like, "Hey, we need Spanish speakers to like take these and translate them and pass it off to our people. So yeah, there are demographic shifts in the United States, right? Like let's just call a spade a spade. Like the country's becoming increasingly more bilingual, especially in certain hotspots. Looking at Florida, looking at Texas, Arizona, California, places like that. And I think there's a large market share that people aren't getting, or their operations could be streamlined by having that advantage. So, for me, like if you wanted to, we could do this in Spanish. So not bad for a redneck from Ohio, but I did figure out how to speak the language. But there are all kinds of different opportunities there. And especially like, kind of going back to logistics, like I said, if you're a company and you have cross-border shipments from Mexico to the United States, which I'm sure is very popular on your side of things, or you're trying to attract talent in foreign markets, like, hey, look, we're here. We'll help you guys with this. We'll help you with customs clearance within crossing the border into the United States. Like you need people that can go out and actually speak that language because, I've ran sales calls where somebody doesn't always speak the same language as me. And there's been friction in those calls. And I think we've lost out on sales in that at Airfreight Express Global and other companies that I've worked for because, an international airline, for instance, if we're talking AOG, they want to be talked to in Spanish and I can do that now. But before I couldn't. And, so you're explaining all these things and they're kind of getting it because they're a little bit bilingual, but they're not getting the full picture that you're trying to paint through your customers.
No, that makes a ton of sense, Zach. I want to dive into a little bit more about kind of you being a digital nomad, living in Latin America, working logistics. So what prompted you to move to Latin America? Like, why did you, decide to become a digital nomad working in kind of the logistics space? And we'll go from there.
So, I was living in Washington. This is not a uncommon story, but I was dating a girl from Colombia when she was living in Washington, D.C. She was there on a student visa and we were doing really well, but eventually those visas run out. She had to go back. It's so common. It's called the Colombiana story within like all of Colombia. So she was like, well, I'm going back and like all this other stuff. And I won't bore you with the details of the relationship, though it might be good for your viewers. But she was like, come to Bogota. Now, I'd been out of the country if you count Puerto Rico, and I've been out to Canada, but you can get by on English there. And the only thing I knew about Colombia at the time was all the stuff that you see on the Netflix show, go look it up, which is not positive, right?
Yeah.
I knew our coffee came from there, and I knew that they had some problems in the 80s and 90s. And so, I'm this redneck kid flying down from Washington, D.C. into Bogota, like, oh boy, like, I don't have any idea what to expect. And when I got there, what I found was this completely different than anything else I'd ever experienced before. And so I got to thinking, I said, well, if this is different, then other places have to be different. And so, I kept coming back to Colombia, but I'd been to the Dominican Republic. I'd been to Germany, France, Spain, hoping to get to Kenya at some point this year, Mexico, Panama, Peru, all these different places, right? And I kept picking up the language for the Spanish speaking countries, and English gets you really far in Europe. So I was kind of good there. But realistically, like I just kept coming back to Colombia. And so Colombia, and I'll just tell your listeners right now, Colombia has what's called the digital nomad visa, which is something where if your employer provides a letter and you can prove that you make over a certain amount, you have a clean criminal record, anything worse than a misdemeanor, they're not, letting you out, or they're not letting you in. But you can live in Colombia for up to 2 years. I'm currently in the process of applying for that. And eventually, hopefully, I'll be buying a house there and getting my residency. And I'm going to make that my home base of operations.
No, that's super cool. So let me ask, like, what are like some of the driving factors that keep you there, right? Like, I mean, obviously I'm sure cost is one of them, but it's also like a very beautiful area, very beautiful country. What are like some of the like challenges? So for some of my listeners, I know several listeners who probably have entertained this or want to entertain this. So what are some of the like challenges that you, I guess, had in the beginning or maybe still have to this day?
So the biggest issue is just making sure you're compliant with the law of whatever country you're visiting. A lot of
Yeah.
countries kind of look the other way if you're working for a different foreign company within their borders for a set amount of time, whatever that is, right? So you always want to make sure you're staying compliant on that side. Luckily, I have a lawyer that manages all that for me, so I don't have to worry about it. The other part of it is, I think realistically, and this is less so for maybe the freight brokers, but I think if you want to be a digital nomad, logistics might not be the industry for you.
Yeah.
Like if that's your driving factor and that's what you want to be, there's a lot of companies that don't feel comfortable with that. I'm extremely blessed that Airfreight Express Global was like, look, you are good at your job. As long as you meet these requirements, we are set. And I said, great, love that. And so, but that took a really long time. Like I had known that I had wanted to do this in 2017, and I didn't really start doing it until 2021, 2022, and like making this work. So now I've been in Colombia for almost 3 years, but, before that, it was just banging my head up against the wall or finding out, hey, you can go and work from another country, but it's only for a set amount of time. So, you need to level set your expectations. I think right now in the United States, there's really a drive to return to office. And I think that's misguided, not just for the outside of living standpoint, but like, for instance, let's say you're based in Houston, right? And you have a company based in Houston. Well, I would like to hire somebody who's based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but he has to come to office. So now this person who's perfect for my company and a great culture fit and all these different things now either has to move to me or we have to move on. And, and I think we all saw last year, the freight industry took a little bit of it took some hits. And so like there were some layoffs that happened last year, mass layoffs. And so then if I'm in Minnesota, why am I going to move to Houston in an industry that's very volatile? And so, I think like realistically in logistics, there's a hesitancy to move on to remote work, but I would really encourage that, even if you don't let people live outside of the country.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, remote work is just one of those things that should be here to stay, right? I mean, if being based in Houston, if I find a company or a company finds me, there's absolutely perfect that's on the other side of the country. Why should we not be able to work together? Because you want to, hamstring yourself into only having remote or only having on-site workers or hybrid workers. It's just kind of silly, in my opinion. I feel like you feel the same way. It just kind of doesn't make sense if you're trying to build the workforce of the best people to help your company grow. Sometimes those people are not always in the city that you are looking to hire.
Sure. And the other thing is, I think a lot of times, like I told you, I knew I wanted to do this back in 2017.
Right.
And I had to find the right situation in order to do that. And like I was working remotely before COVID, but it was under no unclear circumstances I could not be outside the country for more than 2 weeks at a time. And I honored that. Now, there was another company that was kind of like, my boss was cool. He was like, yeah, just don't tell me. And I was like, all right, cool. Like I cannot tell things with the best of them, right? And so, I went to, I would spend 6, 7, 8 weeks at a time outside and then come back. I was living in Florida at the time. But realistically, I think it's always good to be above board with your employer. I think starting out in logistics, especially, it's good to have like that community, the office space for your operations staff. And then as you grow and like build a revenue and a record of excellence wherever you've been, right? That's not me patting myself on the back, by the way. But, as you build like a record that people can trust you. Yeah, exactly. I think there's a way to do that and be cool with it and make sure that like the biggest thing is you just want to protect your company and protect yourself against like any type of like weird situation with any foreign government, obviously.
No, for sure. That makes total sense. Now you had mentioned that you've been there for about 3 years. Now you want to put down roots. You want to make this your home base. You want to buy a house. What keeps you in Colombia?
Honestly, I just have too big of a sense of community there.
Makes
for
sense.
anybody listening on the podcast, you won't be able to see this, but I got my Independiente Medellin shirt on, which is the soccer club that I support within the city. We have a big group that does that. I coach American football down here for adult league. Like it's not professional, but they pay to play. And then like man, it just, for a long time, I thought I was going to live in Bogota. And my buddy who lived there was like, I think, you're a guy from Ohio. You need to go check out Medellin. I think the personality matches better. I said, all right, I'll go check it out. And I didn't think anything. So I ran it on like a 6-week trial, right? I was like, I'm just going to go for a month and a half and see what it's like. And I flew in. And I think in week 2, I called him and I was like, yep, this is it. And so, it's just a really unique place. And I think it's a place that can benefit from investment, both locally and internationally. And you see businesses there. UPS has offices there, like
Yeah.
physical offices. They're not subcontracting that out through somebody else. They have a physical operation. Shankers there. I think Cuninago has one in Medellin, but they definitely have one in Bogota. And of course, in air freight, going back to that side of things, Bogota is the #1 cargo airport in that continent. There's so much cargo that moves through there and people. El Dorado is kind of like that gateway between the U.S. and spreading out across Latin America.
No, that's interesting. So let me ask this. So with you wanting to put down roots there, having such a big sense of community, in Medellin, what do you think are like your top 3 or top 5 like favorite things that you've done since moving to Colombia? And what do you think? And what is maybe on your to-do list that you still haven't done?
Within Colombia or in general?
In Colombia.
Okay, perfect. Um, so, once I picked up the language, I got a lot braver, right? In a big
Yeah.
major city, you have a lot more
Let
resources.
me ask this real quick. How long did it take you to really learn the language? Not
I
terribly
started
long,
learning.
like living there.
Yeah, I mean, I picked up a lot more living there than I ever did, like doing classes or I
Yeah.
also had the benefit of living in the Florida Keys, and there's a very large Cuban population
Yep.
there. So I was working alongside them. I was bottling up a couple of phrases that I had to start conversations and then just kind of figuring it out.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I took classes last year. I got my official
Oh, cool.
certification. So, I'm certified bilingual at this point. I'm not the highest level, but I'm the second highest level.
That's awesome.
So, but to go back to your side of things, like some of the coolest stuff I've ever done, like I've gone out to the remote regions, like those places I told you about that aren't connected by road. And I've actually learned, and I'm really not trying to just bring this back to logistics all the time, but like there's an example. There's the Pacific region. It's Choco is the name of the state, right? But I was in their capital, and that's where the road really ends, in their capital. And what they do is they get these big boats, like really long, probably about, you can't see my apartment, but it's about as long as my apartment. And they load it up with things like kerosene, water, beer, like other things that they need to sell along these other towns that are based up on the river where these mining encampments take place.
Yeah.
And they'll even load it up with motorcycles because, you can't move a car up that way. And they'll take it right up the river and distribute it. So like, there's a ton of stuff there that like really needs that kind of air freight investment, though probably wouldn't be as big for those river towns. But I've met just so many interesting people, and I think the people really are what makes it the best part, right? Like
Yeah.
Colombian people are super friendly. The people I've met, I always tell people I'm a lucky guy. Like I've met some really interesting people all over the world in all my travels, but the Colombians by far and away have been the most hospitable towards me. And it's sincere. It's not, okay, we're going to say this and then we're going to talk about you behind your back. Right.
Right.
Like it's legit. Like I have a friend who runs like a little small shop there. And he invited me like every holiday that I don't go back to the United States for, that's a major holiday, I'm at their place, like it's like my family really.
Yeah.
So that's cool. I've been involved in other things in the community. I do a little bit of volunteering once a month with a soccer foundation that uses soccer to keep kids out of downtown. And then, the soccer club, like we have a group of guys that meet up before every game. We have season tickets. We go to the games together.
Cool.
Usually we leave pretty frustrated because my team is the equivalent of the Cleveland Browns of the Colombian League. Yeah, it's pretty sad. And I think those are the top things. And then, as far as things I'm working on, I'm a big believer in hustling. Like I want to bring air freight into Colombia, and that's a professional goal. It's also a personal goal because I think there's nobody else really doing it. at least not direct like we do it. They're doing more like consolidations and putting things in that space, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it'd be a completely new service. The other thing is I want to keep continuing volunteering. I'd like to kind of maybe see what opportunities are there for me in order to kind of give back to a country that didn't have to accept me, but really did.
Yeah.
Um, and then lastly, I do want to kind of get involved in the tourism business. I think I have the connections to do it. Start it in Medellin, branch it off into other cities, and then over time, maybe even countries, but that's way far down the line. So, we're looking at a lot of different cool things and trying to kind of give back a little bit too.
No, dude, that's really cool. I love what you're doing, and kind of that you found your sense of home and community down in Medellin and in Colombia. Well, last question before we wrap. What are you most bullish about in air freight and logistics for the rest of 2025?
So, I think this is going to be, again, I don't want to get into the politics of it, right?
Yeah.
I'm not endorsing or talking smack about anybody, but I think like realistically right now, there's going to need to be a fast solution on the market. And at Airfreight Express Global, I think we really we pride ourselves on trying to figure that out. There's been a lot of talk about tariffs and understanding customs regulations and things like that. And I think companies that aren't just based in one country and then subcontracting out are going to have that advantage because they have people on, kind of monitoring that and being experts in their field. Like for instance, and again, for any of our listeners, I'm not trying to plug Airfreight Express Global. Feel free to give me a call though. Happy to hear from you. Um, what we tend to do is like we have offices, our head office is in Munich, Germany. We have two other offices there in Germany. We have one in the Eastern Bloc in Romania, Hong Kong, Brazil, and now in New York City. And so, what we're doing is we're building this up so we are able to uniquely like identify these customs regulations as we kind of get into these broader discussions of intercommerce.
Right.
I also think that there are, the airlines definitely feasted during COVID. And one of the things, that didn't go down, but now you see like ocean freight's getting a big push because it's still like the most economic route. But the airlines are going to end up having to match that to end up expanding their share. I also think brokers are going to start getting involved. Right now I'm talking to two brokerage firms. They have their independent brokers within there. What I'm trying to work with them on is, hey, look, you're already picking up from the airport anyway. You might as well just be that point of contact and let us worry about the import side of things, bringing it out. And if you need to, we'll help you bring it out of the country as well. But though that's lesser of a need for like domestic freight brokers, because that way, like we can expand the wallet share of what your clients are currently doing. It helps us. We make money. It helps you. We make money. We'll figure out a way to do like a profit split on that front. So, I think the future is pretty bright, to be honest. I think some lanes will be bigger than others. And I think that like I said, I think there's a vacuum of unidentified markets yet that are kind of just doing things the way they've always done them. And air freight can be like a huge value add for them.
Yeah, no, and to touch on your point, Zach, and not to be political, but whether you love the incoming administration, you hate the incoming administration, logistics really thrives on turmoil. And the more kind of turmoil or kind of change that's going to happen in logistics, like you said, tariffs, the threatening of tariffs, pulling tariffs, changing of code, there's going to be a lot of changes, and that's going to disrupt the logistics space. And disruption is good. It makes all of us money, whether that's from the air cargo side, the broker side, the carrier side. Everyone can kind of thrive in that environment of disruption because, in disruption, the only thing that kind of happens is more disruption. So we'll just kind of continue to see what happens in 2025. And we'll definitely have you back on the show, towards like the middle or back half of the year and kind of see how things are going on the air freight side and just kind of, check back in, man. I really appreciate you kind of coming on the show. If our listeners want to connect and they want to learn more about whether that's air freight in general or about Airfreight Express Global, where can they find you guys?
So I always tell people I'm a recent convert to the Church of LinkedIn. But you
Let's
can
go.
look me up. Yeah, you can look me up and try to talk to me at my LinkedIn. which I'll provide you a link after this. I'll also provide my email as well. But I also encourage people to check us out at expressglobal.aero. We can walk you through what, if you are looking to get into this space, whether you're looking for a partnership or whether you're looking for a direct client kind of relationship. We'll work with you. We'll lead with transparency, and we'll tell you guys how we can best service your needs. And we're not afraid to say no. We work with everybody who's, I think there's like a lot of people who don't want to take on like those smaller clients. I'll work with a guy who only gives me 2 shipments a year. I'll work with a guy who gives me 200 shipments a month. Whatever it is we got to do to help you guys out, we'll work with you and we'll give you the same kind of level of service across the board.
I love it. If you guys want to check out Zach, we'll have all of his links in the comments for the website, LinkedIn, and for his email. If you guys like today's podcast, please make sure you give it a like and review. It does help us out a ton. And we do drop 3 weekly newsletters at thinkfreight.io, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And we'll catch you guys in the next episode. And don't forget to think freight.